Yeah, hello everybody, and welcome to the Norwegian language war. My name is Werner Skalla, and I'm going to show you maybe slightly unexpected side of a country that is considered very peaceful and calm and quiet. But Norwegians actually have a side that is, much more bloodthirsty and full of conflicts, and that's the question of written Norwegian. The written Norwegian language is actually something that has been highly debated for more than 200 years. And it's surprising also when we think that there are just 5 million people in Norway and they need two variations of their written language, which are not very difficult, which are not very different from each other. We're going to see it in a minute. And this surprises also from another perspective yet when we think of how similar the Scandinavian languages are in general. Look, I have the same sentence here written in first Swedish and then Norwegian and then Danish, and you can see that it's basically almost the same. You will recognize the texts right away. If you can understand one language, you can understand all the other ones. So why the fuss with Norwegian? What's the problem with Norwegian language in particular? And to understand that, we have to go back in history for quite some time, and we have to look maybe also at a map a little bit. In the Middle Ages, up till 1200, 1300, basically the Norwegian language was extremely similar to the Icelandic language. So even though these countries are very far apart, the languages were very, very similar. And then in the 1300s, three things happened more or less at the same time that changed the Norwegian language quite dramatically. The first one was that there were more established trade connections to the European continent. And with it came tradesmen from the Hansa Union, and they brought German language, Dutch language, and much more Danish influence to Norway. And the language in Norway started to change while the language in Iceland remained the same. The second thing that happened was that the plague came and killed, it's a bit debated, 1/3 or almost half of the Norwegian population. And there were many new settlers from the south, also from Denmark, from North Germany, or what is today North Germany, Netherlands. These areas had people coming into Norway, and the languages would start mixing. And the third thing that happened was that the Norwegian royal family would die out. And in 1380, Norway became officially a part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So from then on, for the next 434 years, the capital of Norway was Copenhagen. The whole country was ruled as one country, and that brought also even more influence of the Danish language into Norway. Of course, how did people write at that time? Well, most of the people didn't write at all. Not Norwegian, not Danish. Literacy was unbelievably high, but the people who could read or write would write in Danish, because that was the only language accessible at that time. Think also of the education system. There was absolutely no university in Norway until 1810 or 1812, something like that, when the University of Oslo was established. Before that, everybody who wanted to take a university degree had to travel to Copenhagen and study there. So the situation was quite clear. Norway would use Danish as an official language. And even the Danish language was not very well codified. That changed only with the Reformation. So just like in Germany, where we had Luther translate the Bible from Latin to German, and in that way standardizing the German language in a way, the Danish king would also order a Danish translation of the Bible in 1550. And through that, the Danish language got very much standardized, and of course even more spread in Norway than it already was before. So that was the situation, as I said, for centuries and centuries. But then in 1814, things changed really, really dramatically, because Norway at that time, or Denmark at that time, was in the wrong side in the Napoleonic War. And as a result, it lost control of Norway, and Norway would become a part of Sweden. But Sweden wasn't really that interested in ruling over Norway. The union with Sweden was not to the same integrity as it was with Denmark before. So under Danish rule, Norway was an integrated part of Denmark. But under Swedish rule, it was more like a double monarchy. They had the same king, but that was it, more or less. And the Norwegians grabbed the opportunity to declare some sort of inner autonomy and to have their first constitution published. You can see the cover of the constitution here. You can read Kongeriket Norges Grunnlov. Well, it's a bit hard to read, right? The Empire of Norway's constitution, and you can read at the bottom also the year 1814. That's when it was written, and of course, it was written in Danish. Yeah, what other language was available? No other language, so people simply wrote it in Danish. What should they have done? But, of course, it's the 19th century, national romanticism. Norway gained some limited independence. Norway would gain full independence from Sweden in 1905, but still, in the 19th century, limited independence, and people said, we cannot continue like this. We cannot use Danish while we're now finally independent of Denmark. So what are we going to do? And basically, there were three options on how to solve that problem. One of them was quickly dismissed, continuing using Danish. Almost nobody wanted that. But then there were two other ideas. One of them was mostly promoted by Henrik Wergeland, the guy to the left. He was a writer, and he said, well, we have been using Danish for centuries and centuries. So taking into account how much contact we also have with Denmark, how similar our languages are, there is no need to really start with something completely new, but we should somewhat Norwegianize the Danish language. So words that we don't use, we should get them out of the language. Instead, we should put typically Norwegian expressions. We should change the writing a little bit so that it fits more the pronunciation of how we would say the same words that the Danes use, but we just pronounce them in a different way. But otherwise, we do not need to change very much. And then we had the other guy here on the right, Ivar Aasen. He said that's completely unacceptable. We are an independent nation now, and we want to go back to our roots, and we want to find what is like originally Norwegian. We want to rid ourselves from the Danish influence, and we want to really find what is our national heritage. And you could see Aasen a little bit like the woke of his time. He wanted to get rid of anything Danish, anything the former oppressor had brought into the country. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here. It's not like Denmark colonized Norway. That would be completely wrong. So some people in Norway nowadays like to see it like this, but that's just not true. But still, there were people who wanted to get rid of any Danish influence. And Aasen thought that he would have to find the language that is as pure and as Norwegian and as little Danish as possible by traveling to the remote villages in the fjords, in the mountains, mostly in the west of Norway, to listen to people. And from that, he would construct something that he thought was like the original Norwegian language. Of course, to be fair, that's nonsense. Had he really looked for the original Norwegian language, he would have had to travel to Iceland, because in Iceland, back at the time, and even today, people still speak more or less as they did 700 years ago, and as the Norwegians spoke 700 years ago. But the language in Norway has changed, and Ivar Aasen thought that listening to the farmers and fishermen in the West was enough. And he collected the ways of speech, he collected the grammar systems, and out of these different dialects, he constructed something that he thought was like the real Norwegian, and he published it as a grammar book in 1848. It was the Norske Folkespråksgrammatikk. It means like the Norwegian, the grammar of the Norwegian people's language. People's language sounds a bit like People's Republic, right? That's not what it was meant to be, but he thought that this is like how the people, not the elites, spoke. So it had a certain social linguistic element to it. And the language he basically created was soon called landsmål. Landsmål basically means something like country language. Whereas what came of Henrik Wergeland's idea, namely to just Norwegianize Danish, was soon called riksmål, which means empirical language. It was a bit funny because Norway was not really an empire, it was just part of the Swedish Empire. But anyway, that's what happened. That's what these two different language projects were called at the time. Up to now, all of this was not much more than just a linguistic project, something like Inter-Slavic at the Polyglot, or but it had no official status. But then in 1885, the Norwegian parliament, which had already existed, you see, quite interesting, a very loose union between Sweden and Norway. Norway already had its own parliament back then. In 1885, the Norwegian parliament would make a mistake from which Norway never recovered to this day. You can see the tiny mistake they made. It's this letter. It looks like a letter, right? It's called vedtak. It means decision. So it's a parliament decision. They decided that these two languages, riksmål and landsmål, would both be official languages. So they probably didn't think very much of the consequences that this would have. First of all, it meant, of course, or it sounded, of course, very nice that, well, people can write the way they want. If they prefer to write a little bit more like Henrik Wergeland suggested, he was already dead by that time, but there were many people who supported his idea, then they can do that. Or if they want to write like Ivar Aasen had suggested, then they can do this. They're completely free. Sounded great. Didn't sound so great for schools, because in schools, what do you do if the two languages are equal? Well, very soon, school children were forced to learn both variations, and that's still the situation in Norway today, actually. So it became quite clear that this was not very easy to handle. Same for the public administration. Public administration had to use both languages. You can, still today, you can annoy people by telling them that you want forms from your municipality in the other language form. So sometimes when you make a mistake in life, you try to fix it by making yet another mistake. And the mistake that came was that mostly socialist political parties said, okay, landsmål and riksmål, so both of these language ideas are not so far from each other. They are more or less, they are mutually understandable, of course. But maybe we can just do reforms of the writing, of the orthography of the Norwegian language. And in that way, we can get these two languages closer to each other. The name of that project became Samnorsk. Samnorsk means something like communal Norwegian, or collective Norwegian, something like that. Sounds already a bit socialist, sorry. And actually it is. It had also, again, some social movement to it. The social movement was that the forms they would use, and I'm going to show you a few examples soon, were mostly gathered from people that they considered working class. So they wanted to change both these language forms, the riksmål and the landsmål, to something that sounded more like working class people somewhere in the east of Oslo would speak. At the same time, to add to the confusion, they would rename the two language forms. They would rename riksmål to bokmål and landsmål to nynorsk. These are the two official names of these languages that are still used today, and they don't make any sense at all. Bokmål means book language. Of course, it's not a book language. You can write just as much as you want in nynorsk. There are many Norwegian authors that write in nynorsk. Jon Fosse, for example, the guy who got the Nobel Prize for Literature last year, he writes in nynorsk. Nynorsk actually means New Norwegian. That doesn't make much sense either. It's not really that it's new. It's new in the sense that it was collected, it was artificially created out of something, though, that Ivar Aasen back then had thought to be the original, the real, the old Norwegian. So, as I said, the names don't make any sense, but they add to the confusion. And first, that wasn't noticed that much, actually. And the reason for it is that the change came very, very slow. Let's look at an example. So how can you write the word the sun in Norwegian? If you know a little bit of Scandinavian languages, you might know that the definite article, so this the, is always put as an ending. So sol means sun. In bokmål, in nynorsk, I think also in Swedish and Danish, this is all the same. But how do you say the sun? So in bokmål, you had to write solen. And in nynorsk, you had to write soli. But many people in the dialects in Norway actually said sola. So the 1917 reform made it possible to write either solen or sola if you used bokmål, or to write soli or sola in nynorsk. So basically the dictionary would suddenly have two forms and you could choose. So you can see where that goes. Obviously the goal was to support this main form sola, so it gets more popular, and over time the forms soli from nynorsk and solen from bokmål would hopefully disappear. That was the rationale behind this entire reform. But unfortunately, people are stubborn, and people used to stick to what they had been writing for decades and decades, what they had learned in school themselves, what they read in their books, in the newspapers, and so on. So the reform didn't really change much, and therefore in 1938, the Norwegian government decided to be a little bit more radical and to make the other forms, solen and soli, illegal. And you can already see like what time that was, 1938. It's the time of horrible social engineering all over Europe, at least. And in that way, Norway was still relatively harmless by only forcing people to change their language. So back then it was obviously very acceptable to achieve any means, any goal of social change with violence. And in Norway, the only thing that was forced upon people at that time, before the Germans, of course, occupied Norway. But in 1938, that was the orthography, that people were forced to write sola, for example. Just to give you a few more examples, and maybe, I don't know, depends on how many questions you're going to have at the end. We will have the opportunity to look at more examples at like how different or how similar these two language forms are. So I told you already about the solen and sola, soli. Sometimes, if you look at the last word here, the difference is really tiny, tiny, tiny. You can see Viken for his linguistic historical regions. There's this H that is not even pronounced. Nobody in Norway would pronounce it, but it comes from the Old Danish. So Wergeland and his friends said, why not delete it over time? The Samnorsk people agreed, and the Landsmål Nynorsk people would have written Viken without H anyway. So no big difference. But then you see other words like example in bokmål is døme in nynorsk. So a completely different word. Aasen tried to eradicate every word that was of mostly German, English, not so much Latin origin, but still, if he found a word that he could replace with an originally Norwegian word, he would love that and he would do it. And so still today we have a lot of words that are that differ actually quite a lot between nynorsk and bokmål, but the amount of words is so small that it's still very easy to understand one language form if you know it. And you can always understand the other one. While we already had this huge amount of reforms in the language, and we had the occupation, and we had like a lot of social change and economic change, we also got new ideas. The people who like to engineer the language also decided to engineer place names. So they said, okay, Trondheim, the city in the center of Norway, well, in the Middle Ages, it was called Nidaros. So why not go back to Nidaros? Nobody would call Trondheim Nidaros back then, but then they settled for this ending here, Trondheim, which is a little bit more nynorsk because this hjem, that sounds very Danish, so they preferred the heim. So today, the official name of the city is actually Trondheim, although still many Norwegians nowadays say Trondheim. The same happened to the capital. You might not be aware of it, but any text that is older than 100 years will not have Oslo as the capital of Norway, but Christiania. The reason for that change was that in, I think, 1625, Oslo burned down, and as it was part of Denmark, the Danish king supported to reconstruct it completely. His name was Christian, so people called it Christiania, and then it got Norwegianized a tiny little bit with a K at the beginning instead of the CH. And in 1925, it was decided to shift back to the old name Oslo. This time was also the time of the telephone. And on the telephone back then, when you wanted to get a connection with somebody else, you had to dial a number. And no, you couldn't basically dial a number. I mean, that was the problem. So you had to call the phone office and then say, I want this city and I want that number. And the problem with Norwegian is that traditionally Norwegians count like Germans. They count from behind. They don't say 23, they say 3 and 20. And that was not very practical when you want to dictate a phone number. So you want to say 23, 46, 45, and instead you go like 3 and 25 and 40. You always have to wait, you have to jump, it's easy to make a mistake. So they decided to completely change the numbering system. So first of all, they decided to remove the tive, that sounded too Danish, and call it hue instead. And then instead of counting from behind, tre or tive, they would start to count from the front and say 23. Okay. Nowadays, though, this reform was 50% popular, let's say. Mostly people now mix up all these variations. So if you want to say the number 23 today in modern Norwegian, you can say 23, you can say 23, 23, 23. All of these are understood. All of these are normal. It's a huge mess. And people would, of course, make fun of it. André Bjerke wrote a small little poem about it. Bjerke was a very famous author at the time. And he, I don't know, maybe there are a few people who speak Norwegian already, they will understand it. Hun var et par og 20, og han en gammel narr. Det heter par og 20 og ikke 20 par. What it means is this, she was at par. At par means a couple. And at par og 20, just saw 20 means 20, means 20-something. So instead of 23, which means 3 and 20, 23, he would say at par og 20, 20-something. Yeah, she was in her 20s. And he, an old idiot, en gammel narr, and then in brackets, det heter par og 20. It's correct to say par og 20 and not 20 par, because if you say 20 par according to the reform of the numbers, then suddenly it doesn't mean 20-something. It means 20 couples, like 40 people, 20 couples. So it's a bit of a joke, of course. He's just playing around with how nonsensical some of these reforms were. But it's true that many of these reforms changed not only technicalities, but they would change. They would make a change in meaning. They would make a change in literature. Schools would change old texts according to new language rules, and of course, butcher poetry, butcher novels, and so we can ask ourselves, how did people react to that in the 1950s? In the 1940s, people didn't really care so much. They had other things to worry about, obviously, with the occupation, and then after the occupation, with getting the country up and running again. But in the 1950s, the Norwegian language war broke out for full in an intensity that would surprise many people nowadays, because, as I said, Norwegians are not people that go to the streets a lot, but back then they did. They would tear school books apart. They would burn school books. They would print leaflets on how to correct your school books. So the parents would sit at home and correct children's books. There were organizations like this one here on the left, Mot samnorske kringkastingen, against samnorsk, so this variation where both Norwegian language forms would merge in broadcasting. Because, of course, the state had one issue. It couldn't really force people so much in a democracy. It could only force the 1938 reform, so the Samnorsk reform. It could only force it upon the poor school children and upon the public administration, and notably here, the broadcasting. But otherwise, people could write the way they wanted. So a publisher could choose whatever they wanted. A newspaper could choose whatever they wanted. And how people wrote in private, that was, of course, up to them. Nobody could force them. So how do you say, motstand, the resistance was mostly against, of course, this public usage of the language. And we have very absurd situations here, because the government back then was surprisingly authoritarian. So they would not go and say, yeah, okay, whatever, you write the way you want, and we can accommodate a little bit. They would force their people with quite a lot of pressure. So there was this case in the 1960s when the state meteorologist went to television and he read the weather report, and he insisted on reading sne, which is a riksmål form, bokmål form, so a form that was not allowed after 1938. Instead, he should have read snö. And what was the result of that? Well, he lost his job. They did not hesitate and throw him into the snow, basically. He was fighting for 1 year, of course, for a lot of public support, as you can imagine, and finally got back his job. But the issue was really that he just had used a form that was now considered outdated. Of course, everybody understood him. Everybody understood sne and snø. Even if you don't speak Norwegian, you realize that, yeah, this is basically just the same word. The problem became gradually, of course, also that the usage of the two languages was not completely equal. Most people used bokmål, so the language coming from Danish, and not so many people used nynorsk. So there has been this constant idea of the poor nynorsk people being oppressed by the bokmål majority. And that fits, of course, also the narrative that Ivar Aasen had propagated back then in 1848, when he said we were oppressed by Denmark and we have to rid ourselves of the Danish influence and so on. There was a certain truth in that, not so much anymore, I would say, but traditionally, yes, because this was not just a linguistic debate about regions and age of the language and Danish influence. This was also a debate between, or a conflict between, city and countryside. Because in the city, a more bourgeois intellectual population would have closer ties to Denmark, to Danish literature, would be more, say, happy to use a language that's quite close to Danish than in the countryside, where people were used to something or preferred to use something that at least could be a bit more similar to their dialects. Private publishers, of course, translate the way they want, and that's the question with Donald Duck. Donald Duck is usually translated to bokmål, but there was a huge scandal in, I think, 1970, when the translator had to translate an English or an American story, a Donald Duck story, to Norwegian. And in that American story, there is a group of people who use a dialect that is depicted as very backwards. I think in the original they use South America, like South States, Texas, something dialect. And she chose to commit the crime of translating this weird dialect into nynorsk, so into the language propagated by Ivar Aasen. Huge scandal, huge debates. The publisher decided to reprint the edition later on. So yeah, so you can see that what this leads to, but eventually, and it took a long time. You can see the reform that caused so much trouble was in 1938, and there were more reforms that we're hopping over now because we only have 45 minutes. But eventually, the Norwegian state gave up the idea of merging the two Norwegian languages. And in 1981, two good things happened finally. I was born and Samnorsk died. So in 1981, officially, Samnorsk was not a project of the Norwegian language authorities anymore. And how did they do it? Well, mostly through a reform of bokmål. So you see here on this slide, how you had to write certain words in bokmål before 1981 and after 1981. And the difference is that after 1981, you suddenly have a lot of choice. So you can write sola, but you can also write solen. So basically it goes back to the old form that was in use 100 years ago. You see the slight nuance here that sometimes they have the two forms presented with a slash, and sometimes they present the second form in brackets. So when they present the second form in brackets, it means that it's correct, but they don't recommend it. What's the difference between sola and kua, for example? Well, sola means the son, kua means the cow, and the ending points to the grammatical gender. So in Danish, you only have two grammatical genders. In most Norwegian dialects, you have three. Nynorsk, of course, has three grammatical genders. Bokmål, traditionally only two. But in 1917, they introduced a third gender. And with the cow, they say, well, the cow, it's quite obvious that the cow is female. So you should actually use the feminine gender, kua. With the son, we don't really care because nobody knows whether the son is female or male. You see the same for other words. You see sør, many Norwegian dialects that say syd, so you can also do that. Fram, the last word here, you can also write frem the way you want. And yeah, that's basically what was the result of the whole policy was that it became more open. And it became more confusing because today, this sentence here, the woman raised her hand. You see how many options you have to write that? 2 options to write the woman, 3 options to write raised, 4 options to write the hand, and all combinations are correct. Only the green combinations are correct in Nynorsk, and all combinations are correct in bokmål nowadays. You can see the amount of confusion. In practice, in Norwegian life, this is a website where you can ask for a fund to restore medieval buildings. And the screenshot I took shows instructions on how to ask for that money. And of course, you can choose if you want to communicate with the authority in Nynorsk or in bokmål. And it's still a debate. It's still a debate. So you can see here, for example, in Ålesund, that's a city in northwest Norway, where they, West Norway, where they were not sure which of the 2 languages to use, and they decided to have a debate on it. And the interesting thing is, I think it's too small here on the screen to see, but the picture itself is written in bokmål, but the description on the right on the Facebook post is written in Nynorsk. I collected a few things that are interesting, might be interesting for you if you want to learn Norwegian at that link, bit.ly/polyglot2024. Because what I do is actually, I'm not sure, maybe we can paste this link also in the chat so you can click on it. If not, maybe you can write it down. It's very easy to remember, actually, bit.ly/polyglot2024. I also created a Norwegian course. It's based on a coherent story that starts super simple and gets more and more complicated. It's about the doll. Niels, he's sitting here behind me. He doesn't move because he doesn't want people to recognize that he's actually alive. And if you enroll during the Polyglot, there is 1 month for free. So if you're interested in this course, this teaches you the entire Norwegian language from scratch, from the beginning, with pronunciation exercises on video and listening comprehension for download and so on. I don't want to advertise too much. We have 10 minutes left, and I think it's time for questions. But maybe you can have a look at these resources. There's also a few free resources. There's a link to my YouTube channel. There is a link to my newsletter. If you have started with Norwegian, I have a free grammar guide, free pronunciation course. And we do that also for other languages. So if you're interested in learning Swedish, German, Chinese, and soon some other languages will come. Danish will be the next one. Feel free to check out my website. Feel free also to send me an email if there is anything that you would like to know, and maybe if your question doesn't get answered now. But then in the meantime, I think we have some time for looking at questions. Mathieu asked, which version is usually taught to foreigners and with what pronunciation? So foreigners learn bokmål. Almost everybody, because as I said before, only 10 to 15% of the Norwegian population use nynorsk as their main language. So it doesn't really make sense to learn it unless you know that you're going to live in an area in the west of Norway where most people use nynorsk. So usually you learn bokmål. I recommend still to learn some nynorsk, at least for passive understanding, and I teach that also in my courses around the B1 level, because nynorsk is closer to some of the Norwegian dialects. And that is your next question. What about pronunciation? Well, the pronunciation and the written language, all what I've been talking about is only about the written language. What Norwegians speak is something completely different. Norwegian is an extremely dialectal language and has no written standard. So you only have dialects that are closer or further away from one of the two written standards, a little bit like Arabic, but that would be the topic of another talk. So I can't go too deep into that right now. Leora would like to know, most Norwegians are aware of this history. Yes, they are painfully aware of this history because they have to learn both languages in school. So you, until 7th grade, you will learn the language of your municipality. So the municipality decides, does the school teach bokmål or nynorsk? Beyond 7th grade, you can choose which will be your main language and which will be the side language, but you have to learn both. Not everybody is happy about that. Most people are actually quite unhappy, especially the bokmål learners who have to learn nynorsk. They often call it spynorsk, which means vomit Norwegian. It's not very nice, but yeah. Sophia would like to know, is the Norwegian people speak casually in Norway a mix of both? Yes, a mix, because it depends on the dialect. So as I said, bokmål and nynorsk are just about the written language. The spoken language is dialectal and is closer or not so close to either bokmål or nynorsk. So you can have people who speak the same dialect, but who use different forms of the written language. Of course, all the Norwegian dialects are not so far from each other. People understand each other mutually, except like some remote mountain villages where you really have no clue what people are saying. But the question of pronunciation is not a question of which written language you use. Mathieu would like to know, are these people advocating to get rid of one of the two standards? Yes. So as I said before, of course, now that this is very asymmetrical, there's only 10 to 15% using nynorsk as a main language. People are advocating not really to get rid of the other language, but to get rid of the compulsory form, meaning that you have to learn it in school. So there are many, this is a debate that comes again and again, that people, especially in the East, especially in the cities, say, why do we have to learn nynorsk in school? We don't want to be bothered with that anymore. It is also about the question of the official form in the radio and television. You have to, and NRK, the Norwegian broadcasting, has to put 25% of its program in nynorsk, which is difficult because firstly, as we said before, well, when we're talking about dialects, it's not even clear how you measure that. So most often they just put subtitles, which is of course completely ridiculous because everybody understands what's being said. But they somehow have to fill the quota. And what happens in the news very often, for example, is that you have one news info. So you often have two people. One reads the news in bokmål, the other one reads it in nynorsk. So then you have 50%. Sophia would like to know, say I want to learn Norwegian, which version should I learn? Clearly bokmål, as I said before. There's not much practical value in learning nynorsk. You might learn it a little bit passively because you will encounter it many times. Yeah, I can show you a couple of examples later. The differences is really tiny. Svi, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. What do they teach young children at school? So that depends on the municipality. So that's a bit of a regional question. Most municipalities in the West, like the tourist Norway, where you have the fjords and the mountains, they teach kids nynorsk until the 7th grade. And the rest of the country, the vast majority, teaches bokmål until 7th grade. From 7th grade, students can choose whether they want to have bokmål or nynorsk as their main language, but they still have to learn the other one as a side language. So it's like, I don't know, 2-3 lessons per week where they have to study the other form. Chris says, I'm a big Norway fan. What city would be the best choice to learn bokmål in the language school? Any city, because bokmål is a city language. So you go to Oslo or you go to Bergen, doesn't make any difference. People speak bokmål or speak something that is close to bokmål. It's not really accurate if I say they speak bokmål, but it's relatively close. The pronunciation in Bergen is still completely different from the pronunciation in Oslo. The sound repertoire is very different. And that's, as I say, because Norway is a dialectal language. When you learn Norwegian, you have to make a dialect choice. Sophia says, which is most common in literature? I'd assume bokmål, but you mentioned the Nobel Prize winner wrote in nynorsk. Yes, bokmål is most common, but there are some very renowned authors that write in nynorsk, like for example Jon Fosse, who just got the Nobel Prize. Mathieu, so I guess you personally use bokmål. Can you write proficiently in nynorsk? No, I cannot write in nynorsk. I write only in bokmål, and when I speak Norwegian, I use a northern dialect, which is between the two. So as I said, like the spoken language does not have that much to do with the written language. Question by Enoch, is bokmål spoken more in the cities, nynorsk more in the country? Yes, by tendency, yes. But as I said, these are written languages, not spoken languages. So what people speak might still diverge quite a lot from what people say. I'm just throwing a few examples why I'm answering the questions here, so you get an idea of how similar the two are actually. Jana says, why are more and more people promoting nynorsk even nowadays, even in bokmål's area? Do they feel that nynorsk speakers are oppressed, or that nynorsk is still more authentic? Both. So there are still people who believe it's more authentic, though I would argue a lot about that, but that's another question. But yes, because of course they feel oppressed. They're not oppressed in the sense that they get discriminated against. They don't, but they feel that it might vanish. Victor would like to know, what are the other languages taught in school typically? English, or does the side language generally take the place of the elective language? No, it's always English. Norwegians are very, very proficient in English, and usually they also learn a second language, which is often German or French, sometimes Spanish. But usually they're quite bad in the second language, but very good in English. Okay, I think that was the last question. We have 1 minute to go, and I'm showing you a few more differences between nynorsk and bokmål. Here on this slide, you see nynorsk on top, bokmål at the bottom. You see also the funny thing about the genders. In bokmål, you have the choice between genders. Sometimes in nynorsk, you don't. Yeah, here I think we don't have the time for reading the entire text in the Norskan Bokmål. But you see the pronouns are slightly different, not really different. Here are a few common words that are also different between the two languages. We have to wrap it up in 30 seconds. Thank you very much for joining this call. As I said, check out my free resources here at this link, bit.ly/polyglot2024. On Saturday, I'll be giving a crash course Norwegian, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe I'll see some of you there. And otherwise, I wish you good luck at the Polyglot. Have fun and explore all the options for learning different languages. Thank you very much for joining me here.